When somebody does a podcast or says something about nitric oxide, whether it's just in passing or a whole podcast on it, people send me these podcasts. I mean, I get dozens, if not hundreds of emails, phone calls, and they go, oh, this guy said nitric oxide's bad. What do you think about this? So I think what we've agreed to do was when we get these, let's review it. Let's have a scientific discussion, and then let's kind of unwind this and look at it. What I always like to do is look through the eyes of that person, understand their background, their perspective, where they're coming from, and then let's discuss the science and then see if there's dissidence or if there's some type of consensus that we can all agree on. But what I like most about this is it opens up a conversation. Yeah. And that is the true basis of scientific discussion. And the beauty of science is it's objective, and it's different than the arts where it's subject to interpretation. I mean, it's subject to interpretation, but there's finite objective measures in science. That's what science is. So we just received this one from Gary Brecka, who is I think a biohacker is, I think, how he's described. I think I've spoken at a couple of conferences where Gary's spoken. I don't know the man personally. I think he's got some good advice, and obviously he's an influencer on longevity and biohacking. I just got an email from a lady who he had podcast, and he mentions nitric oxide in passing. So let's roll the clip, and then let's have a discussion on it and see what happens.
Instagram all the time about breath work, but you can wake up in the morning. You can do 8 minutes of breath work, 3 rounds of 30 breaths with a breath hold in between. And this does 2 things. Number one, the number one vasodilator in the human body is not nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, by the way, is toxic. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're taking a nitric oxide supplement because you're an exercise enthusiast or you're a bodybuilder or you want to be more vascular, please stop. That is toxic to the mitochondria. It actually competes for oxygen in the mitochondria, something called cytochrome C oxidase. It pulls oxygen out and forces itself to dock. The major vasodilator in the human body is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide causes our veins to dilate. So by doing breath work and flooding the blood with oxygen and then holding our breath for a prolonged period of time and dilating our blood vessels, we actually, when we breathe in again, we get more oxygen to the tissues. We can actually change the oxygen tension in the tissues.
So look, that's a very profound statement. And look, there are a couple things he said in there that are scientifically accurate. And again, it goes back to taking the scientific observations and misinterpreting what that science is. So number one, I think, and look, this is somewhat dangerous because he's an influencer and he's in the ears of a lot of people. And to make a recommendation of stop taking nitric oxide because it's toxic, I mean, that's a very serious problem because again, and I don't think this guy has any ill intent. I think he's either misinformed or uninformed. But the good thing about ignorance is curable. And so he's right. Nitric oxide binds to cytochrome C oxidase and acts as a competitive inhibitor to the binding of oxygen. But it's a reversible inhibition, and it's cytoprotective. It's protective of the mitochondria. So number one, it's not just cytochrome C oxidase, it's complex 1 and complex 2 where nitric oxide binds and prevents electron leakage and basically allows for more efficient ATP production in the mitochondria. But let's address specifically binding to cytochrome C oxidase. That's the terminal stage in ATP production from molecular oxygen. So when nitric oxide is produced, it binds to cytochrome C oxidase, and it basically is a space holder so oxygen can't bind. But what it does is it allows oxygen to diffuse further into tissue. So you extend the anaerobic threshold, and you basically prevent lactic acid buildup. So it's a built-in cytoprotective mechanism. It's not toxic. I mean, cyanide is an irreversible binder to cytochrome C oxidase. Cyanide is deadly and it's toxic because of it's an irreversible binder to cytochrome C oxidase. So obviously nitric oxide binds to cytochrome C oxidase, but it's reversible. It's on, it's off. Saying that nitric oxide is toxic, again, it's a misinterpretation of the data. And I don't think Gary's a biochemist. I think he's what he called a human biologist. I don't know what his educational background is. But to say that nitric oxide is toxic and you should stop taking nitric oxide-based product is, to me, it's an irresponsible statement. Because again, he's in the ears of many people. He's an influencer. But I'd love to have a conversation with him because I think we can come to a consensus on here once he understands the true science. So nitric oxide is the primary vasodilator. I think he's misinformed on that. Sure, carbon dioxide, adenosine, these are all vasodilators that the body responds. And there's enormous redundancy in the human body. So yeah, if you reduce the production of nitric oxide, accumulating carbon dioxide, or you have adenosine from the breakdown of ATP from ADP, then obviously those are endothelium independent vasodilators. And we need that. We need that redundancy. But the primary vasodilator in the human body, in the cardiovascular system, is without a doubt nitric oxide. And in fact, he talks about oxygen, the importance of oxygen, and the basis for all age-related chronic disease is the lack of oxygen. Well, you cannot deliver oxygen without nitric oxide. So you need oxygen to make nitric oxide. You need nitric oxide to deliver oxygen. So if we adopt his strategy of not taking nitric oxide or eliminating nitric oxide production, then that leads to chronic disease. You can't produce oxygen. You can't deliver oxygen. And the mitochondria become dysfunctional. So really everything he talked about, I think is, and that's a 1 hour and 3 minute podcast interview. We're taking 1 minute of 1 hour. So again, I want to put this in the proper perspective. I think probably 95% of what he says is sound, but the 1 minute he took in there to talk about nitric oxide, I think is irresponsible. And I think, we have to correct that, and we have to basically put forth the science of what the science tells us, have an adequate interpretation of the science. But I'd love to have a conversation. The methylene blue people, the good thing about science is we can agree to disagree, but the data will always win out. And then we can design experiments to actually get the answer to that question if there's controversy. So it's not a power struggle between personalities. It's an open scientific discussion about what this data means. And then once we have a clear understanding of that, now we can have consensus on the best way forward, because I think, and I agree with Gary, oxygen is absolutely essential, but you cannot deliver oxygen from hemoglobin without nitric oxide. You can't get mitochondrial biogenesis and mitochondrial ATP production without nitric oxide. Look, I think these are productive for me because, again, it allows me to see other people's interpretation and then have a broader understanding of what's being said out there, how consumers are informed and educated. And then if it's right, we'll agree with it. And I agree with 99% of what he said in that 1 hour interview, but just that 1 minute, we have to correct that because I think it's misleading.
I partially agree with one statement about the pre-workout sport nutrition. Stop taking the L-arginine-based nitric oxide products.
Yeah, look, most 99% of the beet products out there don't do anything either. Again, these are designed for the number one, they don't contain any nitrate or nitrite. Most people don't have the oral bacteria to metabolize it into nitric oxide. And again, that's the problem. So I would agree with his statement that if you're taking nitric oxide pre-workouts, arginine, citrulline, beet products, number one, you shouldn't stop taking them because they're dangerous. Just save your money. They're really not providing any benefit.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, good stuff.
So we'll do it again next week.
Yeah, make sure you like and subscribe if you found any of that helpful. And we'll have another one next week. Appreciate you coming.